So I put together basically some ideas for this organizational platform we've discussed a bit, and I just uh, tried to like put together some ideas that came out from like basically our discussions and also discussions with some friends and yeah. So this is my tentative like um, it's I think it could be defined like a tektologic spaces. We're trying to like come up with a platform in which uh, um, wait, let me just yeah, okay. um, yeah, so this was Gabriel's proposition for the name. I don't know if it's and so Tektology for Will it's not familiar maybe. So Tektology is basically it was proposed as by this Soviet guy who was friends and then not friends anymore with Lenin during the Russian Revolution, and he was this kind of he was like I think a psychiatrist or a doctor, and then he got involved and founded the Bolsheviks, and but he at some point he wrote this book on what he calls a tektology, which is supposed to be this general science of organization. He conceived that there should be it came the time had come in which you should like try to uncover like general principles that you could use to speak about like both biology, physics, economics, and under the same heading of tektology. So that's why we call it like tektologic spaces. Okay, so it's kind of hard. I always found kind of hard to explain to like friends what the idea is, because it's I don't think there's anything that has tried to done it as far as I know, but it's easier to contrast it to like existing platforms of of organizing things and people and like social networks. So uh, so I think this quote from the Xenofeminist Manifesto is nice to highlight what we're trying to do. So we're trying to design like a richer space than what current like forms like given by capitalism normally gives us. So for example, the AO, we can think about like the waiting lines in government like programs, the assembly lines and the newsfeed. They all um, they all implement really poor geometries in which they are like optimized to do other things, but really making like visible and empowering like the nodes that are actually interacting. So for example, the newsfeed, it's interesting. Like if you think about, you could like represent it like this. You can only like scroll down and then go visit other like chains of things. And this kind of like logic of visibility and interaction of newsfeeds, it gives rise to really like um, they're all like optimized for something else than to actually like socially interact with people. You have all like this critiques on like how they maximize engagement, and they're actually trying to like hack your attention for it to be engaged, and in order to get like ad revenue and this kind of stuff. So you get basically this feed forward chains of like with really low kind of like integration between between the agents, and what you have normally in these architectures, and I think this is also true for like career apps nowadays, is you normally have like a low visibility, like a poor visibility by the agents that participate in the network, while there is normally like the owner of the network or the app has the full information of everything that's going on, and then he uses this information to mine data and to develop like these mechanisms to optimize for like profit and stuff. So I guess another example that gets that I think it's really weird how like WhatsApp groups are really bad when to really try to organize a project with someone. Like you get so fast lost in like the way you basically cannot retrieve anything, and you have a really hard time trying to like organize when things get a little bit bigger. You don't have like anything close to like a folder structure that you have in your computer. Like in social networks, you hardly find it, and that's kind of, I think it's kind of interesting because it's like this basic principle of organizing groups, which is completely like absent
In
in our.
WhatsApp, I'd even say that it's like this arrow goes like this, right? The best you can do is quote a previous thing on the
Yeah.
feed, right?
Yeah. I mean, Facebook, when you try to search something in Facebook, it's almost impossible to find anything. WhatsApp is a little bit better. But yeah, in any case,
I think even it's not built for that, right? Facebook is not to retrieve information.
yeah,
It is obviously everything is assembled in order to difficult retrieving past information. It's not just a kind. I wouldn't say it's just a case of poor man's geometry, but a case of voluntarily. How do you say that? Impeding, like obviating the possibility of retrieving information, past information, right? Like this is on their best interest in a certain sense, right?
yeah, it's definitely not
If you can
like
find things very quick, then you don't have to use it for very long.
Yeah. So I think the same is valid for like if you think about it like from this point of view, like assembly lines, they're also, you basically, I mean, you could say that you're interested in basically like producing the commodity, right? So you're interested in this function that receives raw materials and outputs the commodity, and you don't care too much on you want to maximize this input output function, maybe under the constraint that you want to like minimize how much cooperation workers can have while doing that, and minimize like how much these workers can actually uh, organize and understand what's going on. So one way to do that is basically making like a feed for a network in which you just have like uniform transformations of the commodity with no like reciprocal interactions between these chain lines. So I think this kind of like paradigm in a sense leads to what I don't know, calling like a functionalist view of organization, in which you normally have like and it's related, I get to like the separation between who controls and who intellectual labor, and who commands and who does the manual work. So you normally have like a design, a plan, and then you try to realize that function or plan implementing with some form. And this is in a sense is true for like leftist thinking, in which you normally have like a preconceived program, and we just find like the best strategy to implement it, like maybe run for elections and this kinds of thing. What's left out is that the very like form you choose to organize and achieve this goal actually like shapes the space of things you can like do and see and understand, right? So contrasting to this, we have something like which is related to the objective phenomenology approach from Badiou, and I think it also relates in a sense to IIT's intuition that basically is the intuition that the way that a space is intrinsically like structured determines like what you can do and see within this space. So it's not a question of what you want to do and or what kind of like program you're actually trying to like achieve, but the way you do it actually constrains the space of powers and appearances that follow.
I sent you guys a paper here by a guy called Mel Conway. It's a weird paper, but it's nice in this, that it argues in this direction. So I think it's an organizational designer who compares the structure of committees with the structure of the solutions that the committees present. For example, I think it's for some military project. And he shows that generally there is some influence of the way the problem is divided between the committees and the organization that formulates the problem, so the form of the organization and the sort of solution that it tends to come up with. So I think Ashby did some work on this as well, right? And it's nice to highlight that argument.
So I tried to outline like maybe some general principles of what a richer geometry, like what kind of principles we should have in mind for a richer geometry. And so this organizational platform, like it should be able to model like a wide number of forms of organization such that, and that's kind of like in our outline, right? Such that the capitalist forms, the current forms that we find just appear as a particular poor solution to organizational problems. But we have to do that in not by adding like tons of variables and like just like kind of like assembling stuff. We should like follow some form of like parsimony and homogeneity. So start from similar stuff from the beginning, and which is this. And yeah, so free association means that this basic principle of, I don't know, organization, a communist society in which people can basically like form groups whenever they want, and everything are basically spaces and logics, which I'll explain this later. Then we would like to have composition and scales, which imply that groups can include and intersect with each other. So we can get some structure and some scale out of the spaces. That's how we get like organizational complexity in a sense. Then perspectivism, like everything should be point of view dependent. There's no full view of there's no like God's view in which you can retrieve all information of the network. Then objective phenomenology, what appears is what exists. So for example, normally like social networks, you don't actually, just by looking at your feed, you don't actually know what's actually going on. Like you can see events and you can see all sort of things going on, but you never know what actually is going on, like what's real and what's not. That's why you have such a huge distance between what's real and what's virtual, right? So we would like to have some a platform that in a sense maps, tracks what's actually going on, so that what appears is actually what's going on. And if we're successful, we should be able to revisit some classical problems from this organizational point of view, like bureaucratization, informal power structures, centralization, which are all like pointed, normally like used as the processes when things go wrong, right, for the left. This is, and I think it would be nice to kind of revisit those in terms of the poorness of the organizational like infrastructure we had at hand at the time.
I'm curious about the fifth desideratum, perspectivism. Why do you think this is something to be desired in a platform, communist platform?
I think it boils down to like a security problem. So it's a matter of not being able to have, for someone to have full control and access to everything that's going on. So it's like, it's in line with like,
yeah, I think an example is
a shared control issue, actually. You want to share the control.
No, I think just take an example. It really helps. Like imagine you have in the same platform a study group and some clandestine organization. From the standpoint of the group, it has nothing to keep a secret. Like it doesn't need to keep anything obscure, but the clandestine group might not want to share everything it's doing. So if the guy logs in as that clandestine organization, he sees the study group because the study group is open for him, but the inverse is not true. So there will be no situation. Perhaps there is one particular group that is clandestine for which nothing is hidden because it has its own inside and the inside of other organizations. But if you already have two of those, there's already no bird's eye view, right? Because there's already no way to log into the system that has access to everything.
Yeah, but this doesn't really amount to a full perspectivism, right? Because like a full perspectivist point of view might be something like Facebook, in fact, because nobody has access to what's going on. So this is maybe an issue. I mean, between the fifth and the sixth criteria, right? I mean, maybe I'm not sure if they are.
So no one but Facebook, right? Facebook has access to.
Yeah, not only does Facebook have access to everything, but the perspective of anyone is kind of restricted in the same way.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm thinking like if you have Facebook without the central control, but then you have very little control. You see, this is the issue.
Yeah, but I think
maybe if central control is shared, it seems to me to be a different picture. You see, like everybody has control of everything else, right?
Yeah, but just be careful
picture.
because if I'm in an organization that I don't want to share everything I'm doing, I don't want to join a platform where everyone has access to everything.
Yeah, I see, but I don't call this perspectivism. Perspectivism
Okay.
seems to me to be a generalized condition.
Okay, we're not talking about the philosophical concept of perspectivism. I mean, there's an explicit definition, right? That every view of the system depends on how you're logged into the system. That's, I think, what it means. Like, it doesn't need to be like that profound. I do think that the thing that makes it more profound is that the second point on free association, I would probably write it slightly different just to highlight that it's not exactly the same as forming groups because, for example, you can form a group on Facebook, but what we call a group is fixed, right? So it has an underlying structure. You cannot change it. You can either create one or not create, right? It's different to say that people can, let's say, form forums, right? Not only can you form a group, but you can also define what counts as a group.
Yeah, this is interesting. Yeah,
the moment that you have that, it shifts what point of view dependency means.
Exactly. You know, the moment you have access to how are you portraying what you are doing, not just you can form an X, but you can define an X that you are doing. This redefines condition 5 in a sense, because then you have different amounts of control you might have or transparency you might have depending on how you are defining your hub in the system in a sense. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think you're talking you're saying this, you are saying the same thing, right?
Yeah, but I think that's what Renzo, from what I understand, that's what already he was saying, right? What I really like is the last one, because it's interesting. I mean, this already happens with politics. For example, when I post a picture of myself on Facebook or Instagram, it's a totally weird representation of my life and this crazy cup of coffee that I'm supposedly having in the morning. But for example, political events that were called on Facebook, that's not a representation of a real thing. That's more of a performative thing, right? That event somebody created, it's actually entangled with the thing happening. It's not representing it in a sort of neutral way, right? So, I mean, we already have a grammar for social networks where they are not necessarily representations of outside events. They can be entangled with it depending on how events are defined, right? So I think another way of saying this objective phenomenology thing is to say that the way events are inscribed in a platform or structures are inscribed in a platform is not neutral with the existence or not of that structure, right? Yeah. If you have something of the sort, there is an agreement to only consider that a structure exists if it is there. So it has a sort of formalization purpose, right? Or a legitimization purpose, or if it actually makes something happen, right? So if once it's formalized, it can interact with something else. Then it's already no longer an issue of representation. Like if it's in the platform, it's doing something, right? It's not simply talking about what was done. I think that really makes a big difference.
Okay, I see.
Yeah. So a little more on some general like ideas and principles is how to like picture. I think both at the level of how we could approach the project itself and how within the platform things can be approached. So I think this mimics a lot of discussions like I guess from like the circle, but also funny enough to the forms like the organization in which like I'm part actually like ended up doing, which so the idea is to come up with a notion of political organization or organization in general in which you have not this harsh division between design, program, and implementation and like means, but you have some sort of like iterative experimental approach to the processes you are dealing with. So so the way to see this, I guess you could think about of how you have like certain, like for example, certain movements, mass movements, and then you have some collective that intervenes on it. It has some like preconceived ideas of what's actually happening in the situation or like in the streets, and it comes up with a series of like tactics and practices it wants to like implement and try out. And once the situation evolves in the streets, it can come up and revisit what their ideas were. So in this way, you get closer to like an experimental approach to organization. And I mean I think the circle, right, is approaching is also planning on doing something like this. So I think this idea is useful. Like you have a main space of like thinking and doing, but you have like weekly intersecting spaces in which like subgroups or action groups in which they deal with some local concrete stuff and they reassemble into this bigger space of discussion and try to revisit what was previously taught. And so this iterative process, it's funny enough that it's similar to how like actual like programming developments look like, I think. So you normally have, this is Will taught me that. So on GitHub, you normally have a main branch, right? With like the current version you can like download and use. And people can, like anyone on GitHub can clone and create a branch and try to develop some idea, like change some feature or like actually like come up with, try to implement something and see if it's useful. If it's useful and lots of people use, then the developers of the project can choose to actually merge this developing branch into the main line. So I think this is a good way to like think about what kind of like exercise of organization this platform could look, because we could come up with, we could speculate on what interesting forms of organization would look like, but once we try out in like concrete spaces and see how useful it is and how people actually use, and once we test that, we can know how standard and normal and how much they can circulate.
And I think that what you're saying already points to perhaps the main thing behind all of this, which is, I think the hypothesis behind, two very big hypotheses behind all of this. The first is that let's put it like this, innovation in politics has to do with the how, right? How we do things. Which I mean is kind of a presupposition when we say we can try doing things in one way and then seeing if it's interesting and then merging it or bringing it into some main body of an or a platform or an organization. And the second, I think, hypothesis, which is very important, is that there is a way to capture at least some information about this how, of how people organize on a platform, right? So, for example, imagine you just create groups which are just like Facebook groups. People are getting together to study or getting together to organize some intervention or whatever. That form captures absolutely no information about how they're doing things. So they might report on some novel effect, right? But that novelty was not, it was represented in the group. It's very possible that people just post nice Instagram photos of a protest, right? Or something like that. Meaning there's no guarantee, no information was actually captured formally by the platform. So I think the second hypothesis, which is perhaps the first one is more speculative, more about political thinking in general, but I think what gives this project some concrete import is the idea that, well, coming up with different architectures and having this architecture be plastic enough implies you can actually capture a bit of information about how people organize and the different attempts to organize in different ways and so on in the platform itself, rather than representing that information, right, in this weaker sense. I mean, without that, I think that the very idea that these arrows mean something gets a bit lost, because then it seems a matter of opinion, right? There is nothing of this, a new way of doing things is actually at stake in the platform. It's just, let's say, a sort of diary of attempts of things. To go beyond that and make it actually something that is embedded somehow, at least partially, in the platform, I think that's the second hypothesis, right? That this how of organization can have some imprint on how the architecture of these groups is in the structure. And I think this is what gives the project all its problems as well.
Yeah,
it's like I remember when we were talking like a couple of years back about doing a website, super structured website for the circle. The idea was mainly that the website would replace, so to speak, real world dealings within the circle, like the accountability of notes, everything, and the rules would be enforced almost automatically by the algorithm. Like in that sense, it's almost like the things are happening in the website, in a sense. Like it's not like we do or we used to do. I'm kind of, yeah, you know, I'm kind of absent for a few months from the circle, but normally we do stuff on Facebook and it's kind of this other thing, right? Like the shit is happening, so to speak, in the real world, and we are talking about it in Facebook. I mean, this is what you are pointing at, in a sense. Like the platform should have practical traction, like things that should happen in the platform, not only as a reflection of, you know, relations that are going on outside of the platform.
Yeah, I think a fancy way of saying that is that the syntax of organization should be entangled with the platform.
Yeah.
But when the platform is about something that happened in the past, when you make a change to something, that other thing you're referring to is in the platform itself. Yeah. Right.
Yeah, I see.
Yeah, my last more speculative slide also. So this kind of iterative process, I thought it was nice to like think in terms of like the scale of consistency of organizational structures. Like we could start from like a sandbox, like the way someone comes up and like draws in the sand, some like idea, like imagine if we organize like that, or if we do that. And that's basically some sort of like free association principle. Like you look at the sand or like a clouds and you come up with ideas like that are really roughly based on what was already there. And then you think about like a playground, you have like toys, and these toys already have like a more informed, it's like a more informed thing. It's like this object in which the space of ways you can interact with it is already kind of like it suggests to you the ways you should use it, but it comes to the kids to come up with games in which how to use it. So it's, I think it's a larger level of concreteness. And then we can think about like how a toolbox is what is, once you're at the level of a toolbox with tools, then the objects you find already have a definite utility and then like fixed in it. And then for less like building, and we could like think it in both in terms of like how much structure or how much scale or how much like design went into it. But it's not supposed to be like we are striving towards the upwards end, but it's actually some form of like recurrent process. And if the platform has this freedom, like this power and flexibility in which unexpected things could be like developed that we didn't even know it could be possible, then it has spaces to be used as a sandbox. So I think, yeah, and unless we should come up at some point with something like an infrastructure. So initially, I think normally think about what the platform is. It's a tool for something, right? It does some specific thing, but once it in principle can achieve like the level of infrastructure, then it has its own like, it can be called like a space with its own like inner logic or an interior space. Okay, so this is the last introduction slide. So yeah, I try to list some basic organizational forms which would be nice, would be desirable, that we are able to eventually implement in the platform, and going up in levels of like complexity and scale. So like following roughly on like the modes of Karatani, I think the basic level. So I basically will present ideas for like phase A and phase B, and then phase C. I don't know.
You didn't solve the problem of communes.
Yeah.
Oh.
So I think it's kind of solid to like, yeah, I don't know. But yeah, so the idea is we should be able to like model study groups that once they grow, they can have like some sort of like association with other study groups and work more or less as a research collective or something like that. But once we want to achieve like some form of organization that's used for like political organizing, then normally technologies like this, making decisions and delegating power and having like some protocols that structure like how rules are followed, we should also have that. So from each phase to the other, there are like new technologies that need to be implemented in order to actually allow for these organizations to not only like represent the organization, but actually kind of be part of the reorganization. So I think it will become clearer as we go. Yeah, so the basic entities are spaces, which are of three kinds. You have folders, people, and groups. So I initially tried to do everything as groups, but at some point I realized that people or like users are kind of different, because so basically people can belong to any group and they can belong to disjoint groups. So here's like an illustration of how it looks. You have users, and the users can be part of groups, and the groups can be part of other groups, and the same person can be part of disjoint groups. But groups cannot be part of disjoint groups. Okay, so you cannot. Yeah, so this group is just disjoint. No, wait. Yeah, these are disjoint groups with no sharing members. No, it actually can belong to larger. Yeah, it cannot belong to this group because it has to have at least one intersecting member here. Yeah, okay, but yeah. And folders, the idea is, I mean, I'm not sure if it's a useful structure, but I just imagine that you would like to have like empty spaces with no people in it. That's so, for example, you're a user, you have your kind of like private space with folders, and an organization can have like these kinds of like empty spaces with no people. You can call it folders. But these are the like the primitives, the spaces. And then you have some basic logic, like groups can include each other, they can intersect. The entities can be like proposed, like something can be created. So they can exist as plans. And there can be actions, like things can be related to like actions. One can act, and act will have a precise sense on. So yeah, phase A. You have homogeneity, so it's useful. I think it's very useful once to like try to design the things, trying to solve it for the general case in which you have only spaces and you don't know if they are users or groups. So normally it's the case that users associate and form groups, but you might, if you solve the problem by allowing for groups to associate and form groups, then the case in which like these groups are people, it's trivial. So you actually end up like designing more general structures by doing that, by assuming everything's are just spaces and you don't know who are the users. So keep that in mind. So yeah, so the first mechanism is like creating a group. You have like a bunch of users and they can propose to create a group. And if they all agree, then a group is created. So a group is basically like a frontier which separates an inside from an outside, which means that suddenly what's inside this group is what you can see and manipulate inside the group is restricted to those that are part of the group. So, and this separation is basically defined through belonging, who belongs and who doesn't belong to the group. So the inside and the outside of the group, we can imagine it can contain like different structures. Like you could have like an internal chat or like some archive and some internal like reports, people and other groups. And outside of it, you could have like some sort of like public archive that can be shown to anyone, some like public report. But in principle, we don't know what actually the group contains. I think from like the architecture perspective, we're trying to like develop just like this secure vault in which you can enclose stuff inside. So I don't know how viable this is, but in principle, like different groups could have like different internal like tools. Like they can like have forums, and other groups can have like, I don't know, like just chats, and they can basically develop their own like extensions or add-ons to their internal groups. What the group itself does is basically regulate the visibility and the ability to interact with what's inside the group. It separates what can be seen and what can be done. Yeah, so these are like some basic like stuff that can have inside and then that will be used later.
But I think one thing that's already worth mentioning, just I'm not sure if it's way too specific, if you think this is like a further specification, but I think this is what makes what you call objective phenomenology work. Because one thing is to define belonging by the sense of I was, for example, added to something, right? It's different to define belonging in a sort of conditional sense of if I do X and Y, then I belong. And each group defines what that means, right? So for example, I mean, this works very nicely in the circle today because belonging in this organization is not defined by agreement and the sort of absolute I'm in or I'm out. It's defined by a certain constant activity, right? If I'm doing X and Y, in our case is writing a short note with material relating to what happened in a previous meeting. If you're writing that note with the frequency we define, then you're part of the group. If you're not writing it, we understand that you're no longer part of the group. But it's a sort of, it kind of unpacks what belonging means into a normative principle. That's why we wanted at first to create, we thought that we could create an interesting platform based on this principle, because it's a principle that is so explicit that it can be kind of embedded into the norms of a platform, right? There is something that needs to be fed on the website from time to time. If you're feeding it, you have access to it. If you're not, you don't have access to it, right? A lot of movie torrent websites are like that, right? If you don't upload some movies, you can't download movies, right? It's a conditional belonging. So at that moment, the belonging is not represented by the platform, in the sense that, I mean, in what you presented, it's already not the case, because there are information that is only accessible there. So it's already not such a case. But I think that alternative structure, or the possibility that absolute belonging in this simple sense of either you're in, you're out, could be, let's say, the simple case. But it's interesting to think belonging in this conditional sense as well, because that's the sort of thing that adds, that really, I think, ties together, let's say, you know, actual political work to the platform, because then there is some stuff you need to kind of report from time to time. If you don't produce that, then we understand you're already disconnected, and it's kind of already, you know, moves you out or something like that. Perhaps I'm getting ahead of myself, but I think just for the sake of clarifying how that principle we mentioned before, right? How is it possible that a platform might kind of actually include information about the form of organization? I think that the most simple idea of what it means to belong to a group can already display that sort of situation, you know, where you can define belonging differently. So to belong to a study group perhaps means to feed it with some material every month, or every, I don't know, whatever frequency, right? A Word doc file. Doesn't need to be checked inside, but something must be uploaded, right? Whereas belonging to a group that is doing some sort of internal communication work in the platform implies doing some other form of action that the group itself might define, right?
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, so for like the topological relations one can have in terms of composition, you can have, so X and Y are groups. X can fully include Y, meaning that it can have two meanings. So you can either think of in terms of belonging, like all members of Y belong to X. So it's like a subgroup of X. You have kind of like full association. And this means that Y can fully see and manipulate X interior. So it has full access to whatever X is. So in this sense, Y is part of X. It's part of itself. But you can have like a partial form of association where you don't want to have like full inclusion of this group for some sense. You just have like a partial, and then you have a partial visibility. Y has a partial visibility and can manipulate just partially whatever is inside X. And the condition for this is that they must at least share one member. So their intersection is not empty. And the third case is of a full disjunction between groups. So they don't have intersections, and this group is basically anyone in the network. So it gets to see just the exterior part of X. So just like a note, this doesn't mean that I think that X and Y don't really share any member. Like you could have like two completely like unrelated groups that do unrelated things, and they still have like the member is part of like a dancing class, and he's also like, I don't know, like the neighborhood association group. He's in both group, but that doesn't mean that the group has an intersection. This intersection is also like formalized in the network. Then there's like this just detail, like if we are to allow like kind of like formal separations within a group, meaning like it's a group with we want to create two spaces with exactly the same users, but you just want to delimitate. So I don't know how to. It's just like.
Can I ask what do we mean by the intersection? You're saying that you can have for example, two groups with the same members, but who have zero intersection. So what are like the elements that you want to say are define intersection or non-intersection? Is it like the formal structure of the space?
Yeah, I mean, I guess in practice, if X wants to relate with like a third organization, or if he wants to create like a new group, which is open to like members from like a third organization, then this organization must contain like an element. So on creation of this intersection, you need to satisfy the condition, right? So I mean, so you have like a bunch of people who associate and create a group. The same bunch of people could associate and form another group. But from within the organization, in order to have this intersection, you have to formalize it in some sense. I don't know if that makes sense.
I think it's easy to, I mean, especially if we take into consideration this more logical definition of what it means if belonging changes from group to group, right? It's easy to imagine groups that define belonging differently, even though the same people belong to both of them. By their structure, they will be different, right? So, so in the sense, for example, a group that meets for dance classes, as you said, right? It requires of its members for them to belong some conditions. But if they're also studying something at the same time, what's required of them to belong to the study group is some other condition. So even though they're in both groups, there's no reason to treat the groups as the same, right?
So it's the conditions that define.
Yeah, I'm just proposing this now. I didn't present it in this way, but I think that the thing that gets my attention is that, though I totally agree with the fact that it needs to account for a very kind of flexible way that, I mean, for the possible cases, right, where either, let's say, we have this group and a smaller part of this group is getting together to create a website or create a platform. So it's kind of everyone who is in this group, in that group is also here, right? And it can be the case that what goes on with that other group is accessible to us and vice versa. So it's like just a smaller work project in a larger group. You can have the alternative situation where, I don't know, some of us are working with some other people on some different project and we are in both spaces, right? But you can have two projects that are actually not intersecting at all, even though they contain the same people. But that's actually because of the conditions of what it means to be in that group.
So the definition of a group, or what makes a group, are not the members of the group, but the function that group performs. So, for example, when you are building a website requires many components. In the example that Renzo brought up, and there are so the Y is, or X is creation of the entire website, whereas website may have some graphical components, may have some file components, and so on and so forth. So the overall group, which is X, which is composed of many different functions, regardless of whether people are working, same people are working on those components or not, basically are part of this overall group. So if, for example, two people are working on style sheets for look and feel of the website, the same two people may be involved in basically writing applications to manipulate files. But these are two different functions, and they are disjoint within the overall X. So if we have another Z inside X, Z and Y may be completely disjoint, but they both belong to X, and they could have the same members.
Yeah, that's kind of what I understood, but I had the impression that I might interpreting wrong what you meant, Renzo, because you were defining it more, seemed like more extensionally and not functionally, right? In the sense of, it doesn't really seem to come into play at this point, this sort of distinctions of functions as much as the.
Yeah, I think I thought it more like, so this condition is a necessary but not sufficient one in terms of like extension. You have to further more like formalize it in some sort of like agreement, and what operationally this changes is this changing in invisibility and manipulation. Yeah, so this is necessary but not sufficient. And what in practice has changed is what Y gets to C of X. That's all.
So actually, you're proposing that since you're working with manipulation and visualization as the sort of effects of the different ways these things are composed, right? So if Y is totally included in X, that means it can fully see and manipulate X, right? So you're actually kind of suggesting we entangle together by definition to which groups you belong, and the inner composition of them already guarantee access to bigger or smaller spaces, right? I think that's the underlying proposal.
Yeah, because I think in practice, this comes a lot, and like in organization, and they look like in practice like really different, like creating something from within a group that everyone is part of, and actually having to come up with something that other people will participate. So it's just trying to like account for these two existing ways of associating. So with these principles, you can get a lot of like scale and structural effects. So here maybe what's interesting is like, for example, you have this X relating to Y, so they share a member, but from Y's point of view, he only sees that he's relating to X, for example, but maybe internally they actually created a commission to interact with Y. So maybe, for example, this is like a group, like a political group, and he has to like open some like working group with the state. So the state is something else. In practice, it's not like the whole, you won't have like this, you might have like an internal group which like is thinking, is preparing for like negotiating or like planning inside Y, which is a shared group with the state.
And so if we can just get some state official to have to download an app to talk to a political organization, I think we already, it's already a success.
Yeah. But the only point here is that from X point of view, you get to see this internal like difference. But yeah, I'll repeat that later. But yeah, so from these basic principles, I think you can get a lot of like scale properties and structure for an ecosystem. Yeah, so here perspectives. So perspectives means one thing is that it's different from being, so a person outside gets to see maybe like some public thing of the group and some like intersecting group. But if he's part of the group, he gets to see a lot of different stuff. So like the interior of the group. Furthermore, like the group can regulate its external visibility. So it can actually choose how transparent it is to outsiders. So for example, Gabriel's example of comparing like a study group, like an open study group to a clandestine organization. Yeah. So with this, and if this is actually like implemented in terms of actual, like it's every group is an actual like secured vault in which like with cryptography, then what you get from the point of view of the architecture of the platform is that no one has actual access to all contents of the organization. So if, for example, being part of so this is just like an unfolding of these organizations. Okay, so this is just like layered by inclusion. So if, for example, this being of this member, if you're a member of this group and you're included here, this means that you have like the security key to actually see what's inside and then also see what's inside. And so you can generate, I don't know, like different keys that gives you access to different spaces. But that means that if you're not part of it, you don't have the key to access because it's encrypted. So there's no one in the network who gets to see everything. It depends only if you had a member that is a member of every group at the finest scale, which is unlikely.
A person with no life, in other words.
Yeah.
A god.
An omnipresent God.
Yeah.
With all the security keys. So yeah, one important part is that this is only real and not a representation if you actually have encrypted groups, which I have no idea how hard it is to actually implement this. Okay, so.
Sorry, I have a question about the last slide. I joined a bit late, so maybe it was already answered. But how do you first find out about a group, since no one can see all the groups? How do you discover new groups?
I think you could think of it like you have either like a listed like a website in which you can see a list of groups which cannot be seen, so the outside of the groups can be seen, right? So you could be able to search for the groups and just see its exterior. Alternatively, you could maybe have some unlisted, like an organization which hosts in a server like its own like platform, and it's unlisted, so no one gets to see. But if you want to join like a public like list of existing groups, then you would get to see like this sort of ecosystem in which you wouldn't see the interiors of them.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, that makes sense.
So yeah, we could also think of this platform being able to be hosted like privately in some sense. So scales, we can either like maybe that's a little bit of interface, like you can get to choose how much detail you get to see, like assuming that you're able to see all this detail. But you can also like zoom in into different groups and see, like if you're part of, say, like this group, you can see them at different levels depending on what you're doing, right? So if you're like you have a group and then you have like some sort of commission and you want to check out what's happening there, and then you go there and then there's some sort of task that someone is working on, and then you zoom in based on your like access privileges. And maybe you can have like different filters to like coarse grain what you're interested in looking for. So maybe you're just wanting to look like the general structure, or maybe you want to filter just for like members or tasks or events. And then you will get to see like different coarse grains of this ecosystem. So you could just like look for interesting events in some sort of group of cultural stuff. Then you would filter out everything that's not events. So something like that. Now for like to add some like dynamics. So the groups are to be thought of like something that can come to existence and last and then terminate if nothing happens. So in general, they can be they're assumed to if they are to be inactivated by inactivity, basically. So, but so you'd have to you could implement like creation rules, how groups can allow to be created, what kinds of conditions must be satisfied for them to like be alive, and under which conditions you can terminate a group. So everything of that should be able to like parameterize and decide. The same is true for like new members and expulsion of members, or like also everything you do. But basically, here you have like the three possible states of a space. It can either be like pre-activated, proposed, it can be active or existent, or it can be like inactivated. Then tasks and events are kind of like a subclass of group. An event is a group with a fixed duration. It has like a preset duration. It starts in a certain day and ends. And tasks are groups which its objective is not to last, is to finish. Yeah, so I added this slide because of the discussion. You have to conceive of like some form of like language to program those rules. So I don't know how that would look like, but that could actually regulate these kinds of example that Gabriel gave of what kinds of conditions the member has to satisfy in order to be part of it, which conditions has to be satisfied in order for a group to last. But you could also like configure it in a way that it's just like less indefinitely. So it's actually just a parameter, right? And the same is true for like encoding like the visibilities and any sort of thing, basically. So groups, you could view them from like temporal, you can temporalize the groups and see it from like a history of previous iterations of the group. You can picture like some sort of minimal case in which like you have this group and there's this group, and they propose to form some sort of commission to decide whether they are like joining or maybe just negotiating something. So we create an intersection between these two groups in which they can reach some sort of agreement. So so in general, you can have like all sorts of like dynamics of different ways of relating to other groups. So you can start from 3 groups, and maybe these 3 groups just want to like work on a common project. So they just intersect. Or maybe they want to, these 3 groups are actually part of a bigger group, and these are just like working commissions. But at some point they lose function, like this differentiation, they just can resume to the previous form. And like, etc. So with this, I think there's more or less enough to kind of model an institution. You can like have a common hall with all students, then maybe you have classes in which not everyone is part of, but maybe outside members can join the class. And so this guy gets to see like the internals of this classroom, and you have like a student group room in which like teachers can get in. So this kind of like basic stuff. Now the second phase, which is power. So the idea is that in order to get more like technologies to have things like decisions and rules being used, I thought we could like think of in 3 different forms of constraining. So you can either the parts constrain other parts, the parts can constrain the whole in which they're part, or the whole can constrain the parts. So groups can decide the group rules and change like the functioning of the whole, and this whole in turn can constrain down the workings of subgroups that work inside. So you can have like some sort of rule inheritance that whatever is created inside this group must follow whichever was predefined here. So you can have like some sort of constitution, and everything that's created within it has to follow that.
I think that it's easy to come up with an example. For example, let's imagine that this group requires, for belonging to it, the production of a given document. And we create a subgroup inside of it with members who also belong to this group. So those members will be constrained by still having to produce that document, even though a subgroup was formed. So they inherit that constraint.
Yeah, I think a big challenge is how to imagine like this programming language is powerful enough to code for actual all these kind of like constraints, I think. So the next like logical mechanism is actions. So actions is basically like a directed relationship between spaces. So, and this is used to either validate or decide on something. So you could imagine like they want to create a group. So, but to create this group, you need at least 2 people interest or 2 groups that want to participate in something. So this is proposed, and this guy comes and validates with an action of approval the creation. Then the group is created. The same thing would work for like terminating like a group or a task or something else, or even like an expulsion of someone. But so this is something is proposed, and then to actually like coordinate the decisions, you use this calculus of validations. So you could have like approvals in which the person just says like, yeah, it's fine with me. You could have like participation, which is like an active yes. So this means that I'll actually help with the task. So it's different, like by saying, okay, I'm okay with that, than saying that, okay, I'll actually participate and do work on that. And you can have vetoes. And I mean, you can envision all sorts of actions, but I think these are 3 of the basic ones. And the idea behind this is that we don't want to like rely on people, on just like private existence, like just people saying that something was done with no way of some like social mechanism of validating that was the case. And this will help a lot for like decision processes and like when you have to like distribute work and you have tasks and people say they completed, then you can like use a validation process to actually just like choose people that validate that actually was the case, that the task was completed. So this is an example.
I think that's a weird version of proof of work, where you, for example, we could imagine something like you're a member of the platform if you make available some witnessing of work. You know, if belonging to a group is usually conditioned by producing some sort of document, it means that there is enough information going around for a random witness to read it and confirm that that's what was said to be done was done with some greater degree of certainty, right? So you could imagine that to belong to the platform just as a general member, you need to make available some legitimizations, you know? So you get a list of like pending verifications like that, and people just need to go and read some of them and confirm or deny that what was proposed was actually done, you know? That might be a bit exaggerated, but in any case, I think there are ways to imagine this proposal you made now. It goes very nicely with the idea that, you know, defining visibility and belonging go together as well, because let's say I only have access to some part of the platform. That means that I'm in position to validate actions by people in that or groups in that part of the platform, right? So that could be thought of as a kind of a commitment, not at a level of visibility, but a commitment at a level of verification of actions, right? That goes along with the inclusion and so on.
Yeah, it's true. You could regulate.
I had a similar thought. Yeah, this makes me think a lot about like things like Ethereum and smart contracts and stuff like that. I feel like something like this could be implemented on top of some layer, technologically speaking, like that, and that would solve at least one of the problems, which is who, you know, is in charge of checking that all of this really happens and that people said what they said.
Yeah.
You know, that would be decentralized.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
What's the thing you mentioned?
Ethereum. It's like it's one of these like crypto blockchain technology things. It's one of the ones that were relatively early, and they basically had the idea that the same thing that underlies Bitcoin and transactions of currency could be used to transact just promises in general. In practice, it ends up being, it's like they have a computing language that's Turing complete, and you can have code that runs under certain conditions and not under others, and it only runs given proof of work, as Gabriel was saying.
We would be doing the poor man's proof of work, like proof of very poor work, proof of very little work.
Yeah. So in this example, like you could think of like this task is proposed, like, oh, it's relevant that we do that, but it needs to like obey some sort of condition for task creation, which is specified by the group that this is being created on. So in this case, say you need at least 2 people to actually participate, and maybe no vetoes. So once you get these validations, then these 2 can work on the task, and then they can publish something outside of the task, saying, okay, look at we finished like what we had to do, and then someone has, and so they propose to like terminate the task, and someone comes and validates its termination. It reads the note or like the form, and say, okay, that's okay. So you could think of these guys, they could be like guys who are responsible for that, or they could be like randomly assigned, or like think of different ways.
Yeah, but I think that the way you described it right now really shows that thinking of group, I mean, okay, it is a functional description, right? This group exists if it produces such a document, or if such a task was completed if it produced such a document. But it makes clear that there is a very strong connection between creating things and doing things in this platform and actually creating something that can be verified by others, right? And I also think that it's interesting because it gives the sort of idea that if you don't produce information for others, you don't have access to information, right? So let's say I'm in this platform, I say I want to do something, I don't give any proof that it was done, that others can verify. The consequence of this is that the only group I'm part of will become inactive, and therefore I'm no longer active in the platform, and I lose information about the whole, right? So there's a sort of active process where you only exist if you give others means to verify your existence, right? And the counterpart of that is that then you have access, by the same very principle, you always have access to what others are doing, right? Given some limitation.
Yeah. Yeah, you could imagine like, so this is like a user and he has to publish a note, but you don't have like, the way to know if it's a node is just, you just do like a random validation, like other members has to say, okay, that's a node.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't say that, if this document that says is the node you need to give to be a member, if it's not verified, then you're out of the group. So you don't have to have anyone that's kind of like the trust is kind of like the verification is distributed, right? So
yeah, that's what I thought. Yeah, but I think as a basic principle, it's a very profound principle. I mean, it's actually very common as a basic idea online, right? That to get information, you need to give information. A lot of peer-to-peer processes have that condition, but I think it's nicely put to use of capturing information about organization if the documentation you're producing is connected to the existence of something, right?
Yeah.
To give proof to others that you exist, and if that is a condition for that to continue to exist, is also to enrich the network with more information about groups and so on. Though I wonder how this would function for organizations that are totally black boxed, that don't want anyone else to verify anything. Like there is that issue of security versus verification.
But you're thinking like this verification always coming from outside.
Yeah, true. I mean, you can just constrain who verifies, and then it's part of the organization, right? Yeah, you're right.
So this was like the initial way I had like pictured the tests are like flags, but I think it's more useful to think of them as also spaces. But I mean, it's just notation. Okay, yeah. So some examples of like that explore what you could do. So you could like implement some sort of like majority vote in which the conditions is to have like, at least if you have a group of 10, then you need majority to get approved something you're creating. That this rule that is actually like coding for new constraints in the functioning of the group. You could have like a validation mechanism for tests in which you need, you have a quorum of maybe approvals, but also a quorum of participations in the task. And you could imagine like this publication mechanism in which like you have a page and you want to post something, and the condition is like, okay, it has to be first available for 24 hours so people can have a look, and it will be published if there's no vetoes. And the same for like, yeah, you could just add a condition on like needing like 3 OKs, 3 proofreads, and then it's fine. So, but I think this gets a lot richer once you add the possibility of anonymous validation. I mean, I have this intuition, but I haven't like came up with too many examples. But so in this case, you have a vote on something, and you don't know who voted on what. I mean, that's just like the principle of secrecy of vote. Mm-hmm. And you could also do that for like validation, so that people don't get mad with each other if their task wasn't approved or something. So you don't get to see who validated your stuff. And I don't know how, like, if you can actually implement that in like secure ways in which, I don't know, yeah. So I thought this could be interesting for like trying to develop ways to like generate trust between users in like mass movements in which people don't know each other. So finding a way to track some sort of like trust people has within a certain network. So you could also use validation to actually like just give some sort of like street cred to a person or to a group, and then and you could also like picture how this gets secured to like by regulating the entrance, just by allowing people who were validated by, I don't know, three people, so they have to know each other. And you can add rules to like guarantee the security of who's getting in, and then kind of like use some system of like flagging and trusting people to actually know who to speak to and this sort of stuff. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't know, I think there's space to explore on that.
Right.
So the next thing is power delegation. So you could want, maybe you don't want that every step you take has to be approved by all its members. Maybe you want some sort of like super user, some coordinator who can actually do the actions by the group itself. So he can like, he has the powers of just like creating or terminating groups and tasks, and has some sort of like superpowers on it, but these are all internal powers. And you can also have like an external super member, which is a delegate. So the members can vote to elect some delegate that will do something for the group itself. And then you can have something in the midline. So I think this is useful for like implementing a system of like federation of power in which, so I think this is useful internally for like, if you need someone that has like, is responsible for checking many things. So he needs more like permits to be able to do more stuff than other regular members. So you could use that, do that to elect this. But in the case, I think it's particularly useful for the delegation case, in which maybe you have like this general assembly that will kind of like make people from different like local groups meet in an assembly. So you could picture like a way in which they elected a delegate, and this delegate goes to the assembly and he now is representing the movement inside here. And once he comes back, maybe they can just evaluate and say, okay, you weren't a good delegate. You're not a delegate anymore. And you could do that like in an anonymous way. So if this delegate receives like more than 3 vetoes, then he's automatically doesn't have access anymore to like the assembly. So, and I think the anonymous like mechanism is particularly powerful because it's something that's really hard to implement in practice, right? So I have all sorts of problems of like not being able to say your vote stuff because you know the person and the person will know you chose that. So
yeah, I have the impression that this is also when trying to, let's say, sell the idea to militants and so activists. I think that the hard sell, but it's also the big advantage is precisely that there are anonymity is a good example of a sort of mechanism that to implement you need to give some power to the platform over your immediate action, right? It actually it's a trade-off where you lose some autonomy, but you actually gain some freedom, right? And I think a similar thing happens actually with the idea in general, because if you actually implement some basic normative principles of your organization, they are built into the platform. You lose autonomy. I mean, you're constrained to do things in one way rather than another. Otherwise, the group is not verified to exist by its own standards. But on the other hand, you gain the possibility of actually looking at what you're doing, right? You can, again, like in contrast with a timeline or a news feed or something like this, you can actually track the history of what you're doing and what was done and actually learn something from it. So I think that that's ultimately the thing that needs to convince people if they're gonna adopt this, right? That delegating some of this autonomy to a normative structure that has these principles built into them actually can increase your freedom and also give you that sort of weird, very rare thing in politics, which is the possibility to learn from how something was done. Since there's no place where the how of organizations tends to get imprinted, right? There's nothing that stores this. There's no way to actually learn from it. Like you can't change it a bit and try again because there is nothing to change in that sense. Either it remains what it is, or it gets lost, right? So generally, I think that this is kind of the selling point that needs to.
Yeah, there's a little bit of like a leap of faith in which if the organization really constrains itself by the formal like operations of the platform, then what you gain also is like you certainly have mechanisms to avoid like and disorganized like tendencies of what people call like bureaucratization or centralization. Like you have like an intrinsic mechanism in which the person really ceases to be a delegate from this kind of like random vetoing of himself. Then I think like if for example a party actually functions like obeying this, if any member of it like demotes delegates anonymously, then I mean things change a lot. I think.
Yeah, I think so too. And you also create the possibility to measure how much organizations deviate from what they propose, right?
Yeah.
Because I mean, this is something we learned in the circle very much, because we put so much emphasis on formal rules in this sense. Like you're part of it if you hand in the note, you're not part if you don't. There is the internal measurement of was it done or not, but there's also the sort of fringe aspect that also becomes very intelligible, which is how capable you are of doing what you propose and how impotent you are at following it, you know? So there you actually gain an extra feel for what's going on that is hard to get when the only way you see the rules of an organization is looking at somebody who is in a higher hierarchy than you.
Yeah, so if this, I think we're able to more or less implement some sort of national organization in which you have delegates, which is like more or less. So we're like trying to navigate this space of political organization. Yeah, almost in the end already. So the last thing maybe is an idea which I'm not sure if it's useful, but is the idea of some sort of protocol. So it will be a way in which like two non-intersecting groups two disjunct groups can get to relate via like a protocol, which is something that just regulates some sort of like further constraints, which are not defined through like intersection or belonging, but through like signing a protocol. So you could picture a group that proposes a protocol and maintains it. And once you sign it, you're able to see everyone else who signed it and relate to it via this protocol. So, I mean, this is very broad, so I don't know in practice how this could be used, but I think it's.
But what is the difference between that and creating a group that includes everyone and that has some additional conditions?
Yeah, I think the difference is that with groups, like you can imagine like many groups, and creating a big group is like a single uniform protocol. With protocols, you could have different ways of covering these groups, right? So different groups can sign different protocols, so they don't have to agree with all the same protocols, which would be the case if they all belong to a single group. I think. So yeah, I don't know how this is useful actually, but I think yeah, one example I thought is like something like you have different organizations that like sign some sort of commitment to doing something, and this control, like this agency who controls the enforcement of the protocol, once you sign this, you could have like some fee, like financial fee over the organization that you could like this. I mean, once you have, of course, like a financial infrastructure, but this group would be able to retrieve like funds to like enforce some sort of protocol in the case of like agreements. And, or you could do like some sort of decentralized enforcement of a protocol. Yeah.
Seems like protocols could work well for certain kind of events, like if you're having a large march or something, or you're having a protest and certain groups are planning to get more hostile or active and other groups are planning more nonviolence, you could have different protocols for what kind of groups interacting, and the security protocols that would come in with that, or different agreements about tactics, and yet they'd still be linked up in this common event that they're all, you know, working under the banner of.
Yeah, I think the tricky part is thinking how protocols are like enforced, and it's not supposed to be just a declaration of an intent by the group. It should also have like real constraints over the group. So I think that's hard.
Yeah, I think that you're touching on very classic territory, which is can you have contracts enforced without punishment, right? Or direct monopoly of violence by some third party that audits and then distributes punishment if that's not the case. But I think that one thing that shouldn't really go to the background is that a system that is so tying together so strictly, having access to it with fulfilling some conditions, the punishment everyone is constantly threatened with is not having access to the information, right? I mean, simply not being part. I think that we shouldn't downplay what is the force of this sort of thing, because ultimately we're not really managing what is done or what is not done, because groups that are not in this are going to do things anyway. So they don't want to do it, they won't do it, right? Or if they want to do some other way, they will. They will just open a WhatsApp group and organize it differently. But the cost is, if you don't do it this way, you don't have access to this, right? I think that's a very, very relevant counterpoint to the thing. Like because ultimately what we are intervening on is how visible the way organizations do things is to one another. Like that's the sort of wealth that is being shared, right? Sort of organizational wealth. You can engage with different ways of doing things. You can participate in processes. You're not usually, you can see usually things like this. I think being blocked or no longer participating in that is the biggest punishment in a way. Because any other, I mean, of course, if we imagine a sort of financial structure that goes along with this, you know, some sort of crazy currency or whatever, of course, then you get a different weight to certain parts of it. But I think that it's already quite a loss to not uphold something or to be at odds with the process so often that you get kind of removed from it, you know? Because I think otherwise you need to create a sort of monopoly of these punishments. And somebody needs, I mean, if you have random audits, people are just saying, okay, this was verified, this was not. It's a very, let's say, small, decentralized decision. It's not really, it doesn't really come along with the power to decide what a particular punishment, other than people deciding it for themselves, right? So it's hard to see a kind of a version of regular contracts, I think, at this level being implemented. I'm not really sure
what is it that you stop having access to? Because I think there's the question of whether or not you'd stop having access to a group because you don't follow the particular rules of a group, but that doesn't mean you lose access to the whole platform. Or are you talking about like limitations on the platform itself? And
yeah, I think
like,
all of that. I mean, I just think that's an interesting variable to consider. You know, Renzo already mentioned, like, you can lose access to something. It can become less visible to you if you're not part of it. And I think that the extreme version where nothing is visible to you anymore, it is quite a loss, you know.
Sure, I mean that is a loss, but I'm thinking, like, with regard to these protocols, like if you have two different groups, and let's say, you know, you have an action and one group A does one thing, group B does another thing, and they disagree that they followed through on what they should do that day. If each group internally agrees, no one's going to lose access to those groups. Those two groups just simply aren't going to interact. That's not losing interaction of data as much as different groups failing to come together and not having means to determine, okay, what does it mean for group A and group B to work together in this particular event?
Yeah, I see what you mean. So, for example, there is something that was supposed to be done by these two groups. Something is done, some proof of that action is produced, but that doesn't mean that people will agree on if that was true or not. That's your point.
Yeah, like an example in the States a lot is, you know, you'll have a protest against some kind of fascist or far right, and you'll have a kind of militant black bloc group that wants to get in their face, get rowdy, and you have a more non-violent liberal leaning group that wants to protest but at a distance. So group A is more militant and is explicitly so. Group B is more non-violent, is explicitly so. They come to form some protocol about what it means to work together on the day of the protest. And then they end up diverging in what they actually do on that day. And what becomes the mechanism to hold to, you know, that kind of agreement, a kind of tactical alliance, which isn't a violation of either the group's internal logics or of the platform agreements, but is nonetheless a potentially dangerous strategic mistake if it leads to police repression, loss of political support, yada, yada.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think the platform should punish error, right? I mean, that makes no sense since we want to capture error in a certain sense, right? I mean, that's part of what they should be able to do, to actually log conflicts or mistakes in some way that they can be referred to later on. But I think I find that an interesting example where I just imagine this meeting between a liberal and a black bloc group, where the fact that some of them, you know, are ready to bring stakes to the fight and some are not, doesn't come into the discussion, and they just find out later on. I find that a bit, but yeah, I don't know. I mean, one thing I was gonna say is that generally contracts in their very form don't imply two parts, they imply three parts, right? I mean, by some definition, social contracts are not, let's say, when one part agrees with another, that's just an agreement, right? Contract is actually when that agreement is validated by an impartial third part. Okay, 99% of the contracts in the world, the impartial third part coincides with one of the two parts. You know, like, I'm gonna dominate you, otherwise if you don't sign this contract, I'll kill everyone. That is the common historical form of contracts. But the form of it is that there are three parties. So perhaps that could be relevant, you know, that the assessment is, for something to be called a contract, the assessment shouldn't come from within. Like, you need to give some sort of access to a third party, I don't know.
Well, that might be where a protocol could then be like submitted to a general assembly. If there was like under Occupy, like a protest under the banner of Occupy, but multiple groups involved, then each of those groups could be evaluated by protocols that they agreed to by some larger body like a general assembly. And then you could have whatever mechanisms you had in place to assess that. If there were things that could be automated, you can do that, whatever that looks like. I don't know about implementation.
Yeah, what I like about the place this is heading is that I think that there is a very uncommon situation that for this platform to work would have to become very common, which is meetings to assess what happened amongst non-agreeing parties. I mean, that idea that, for example, a bunch of groups are, you know, mobilizing to organize a protest. The question, did the protest happen, is something that needs proof of work by a third party, as everything in this platform. But that decision, because this is politics, is not something you just, let's say, read a document and it's done, right? It might be a very fragile statement to make. But the very fragility of this requires the sort of situation where it should be possible to debate, right? If you went into this together with very different organizations, you're already committing to do an assessment together with those organizations on the other side, right? I mean, I don't think this platform, I think it would cool off some false conflicts because you have more transparency and so on, but it surely would also heighten some true conflicts as well. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, there are definitely some debates that we only get to have on fucking Twitter that have absolutely no real content to them. It would be totally different to have that debate with an actual process under discussion, you know? But perhaps that's the sort of thing we need to account for, that the validation of certain actions that imply non-agreeing actors, right, who only agreed on some conditions, might be a very tense effort in itself.
That is a good place where documentation and like Renzo was saying, getting past the kind of linear aisle model of feeds and stuff would be important, because in a lot of these debates, in my own experience, and I'm guessing in others, like, you quickly run up against the lack of documentation when you're trying to refer back to decisions, back to the reasons that you did things. You're like, well, you know, we kind of thought this thing was going to happen. I don't really remember because we've done a lot of things since then. And with this platform, we can build in that documentation process and make the interface much more usable.
Yeah, I really think that ultimately, I mean, from what I understand from Ren's presentation and other things we discussed, I think that the core of the project, like the basic ideas. I mean, there are those two general hypotheses about the form of organization is a very important part of politics. This form might be something you can capture in a platform. But I think that the core of that follows from this is this idea that to form a group is to define for yourself some criteria and some way of verifying those criteria. And I think just that basic idea, you know, and an architecture that makes those verifications possible in a kind of horizontal or even random way by users is already creates a structure of you know, mapping of what's going on and assessing of how people are doing things that is already pretty impressive, you know.
I have a question. I wonder if there are advantages of this, I guess, kind of approach in terms of, like, for example, on Twitter, right? On like left Twitter, you see that things kind of devolve into like these petty little like arguments about things that ultimately are like maybe not important to the bigger project, or I guess like things get diluted very, very quickly. Do you feel like there's, like, I feel like there's kind of hints of how to build more unity within this sort of platform, but do you have anything else to say about that? I don't know. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'm not sure if I follow, but I think that one thing that follows from the thing I was saying before, that goes in the direction of what you're saying, is that I think that if this makes sense, this idea that, you know, to exist in this platform, it's to offer some form of verification for the normative principles of what a set group is, right? And there is some basic architecture allowing for the plasticity of these norms to be set, but at the same time allowing for people to have access, some relative access to verifying this information. The big issue is if this allows for a workflow of projects that are not concatenated like in a just part whole machine-like way, right? But actually a functional concatenation where we set the rules for some group, then we set rules for subgroups, and those groups can function like departments in a project, you know, and you actually get, for example, Renzo structured something like a classroom or a set of classrooms, right? The issue is, can a structure whose parts are guaranteed by this sort of random verifications and document productions, can it actually mimic not the representation of a classroom, right, but the functioning of a classroom? I mean, the classroom for me seems actually like a really good example, because I do think it is quite possible to imagine, you know, a group of students, they agree on with the teacher, what is the syllabus, who's going to produce what by when, right? That is a documentation that can very well be available through this platform, and it can connect with other classrooms, and there can be a group for the teachers who also need to produce a particular document for that group and so on. So, but the question, I think, for unity in this functional sense, right? It's easy to imagine a unit in the sense of a visual unit or just a compositional unit in this more mechanic sense, right? Of parts forming a whole. But if you can actually form a functioning unit, I think it's an added question, right?
I think one thing on the Twitter topic is like, you know, the one defining feature of Twitter is that everything is public and accessible to everyone, right? So maybe the dynamics, the dynamics that hold there, you know, which end up being these kind of reputational dynamics that lead to pettiness and, you know, one-upsmanship and, you know, frustrating discussions. Maybe that just wouldn't appear in this, where things are more, you know, the visibility is much more hierarchical or, you know, decentralized. So maybe it just wouldn't be a big issue if we're optimistic.
Yeah, I tend to, I think the mixture of anonymity and forums having a purpose, like there is a task and there's a forum for the task. I think if one thing social networks did teach is that this bargain of all the information-rich structure is on the backstage for developers, and you get this feeling that you're free-floating in a horizontal space. That's a very bad bargain, in fact. It's not freeing at all, right? It quickly creates this kind of morphodynamic situation where pretty much what you can do is create some bickerings between people because you don't have enough information to do anything else, really, right?
In a sense, it's not content-oriented, right? Like social networks are not content-oriented so much as people-oriented or avatar-oriented, something like that. Like, it's not clear you are associating for a reason. I mean, there are certain networks where there is this aspect. Like, for instance, SoulSeek. I use a lot of SoulSeek. That is a music sharing peer-to-peer platform. There you have like closed groups for certain genres. There are certain rules. You have to share something, otherwise it's quite similar to some of the stuff you're talking about. You have to share something, otherwise people won't share their stuff with you. But I mean, Twitter, Facebook, it seems it's all like that. The hub is always this individual avatar, and its engagement is not justified in any collective sense or content oriented sense. As we were talking in the beginning of the discussion, it's even difficult to retrieve information. Like, it's almost impossible. They make it almost impossible in order to have always new content, new personal content being generated all the time, instead of having an ongoing discussion about something that was posted like a couple of years back, for instance. It's difficult to have this on Facebook. It's not really content oriented in that sense.
Yeah, but for example, imagine this, right? Because I'm more and more convinced now that the basic idea that needs to be tested to see if any of the other things are viable is imagining basic parameters which, when defined, give you the shape of a group. Like, because, for example, imagine that when you posted something on Facebook, a window opened and it allows you to regulate the frequency in which that discussion will be brought, right? The type of comment that it accepts, like something that regulates the form of discussions that thing is involved in. So the shape of the post, the architecture of that post will already, let's say, bring some form into what goes on. I mean, I think that's the sort of intuition that's the basic idea. And it makes sense that there is a very complicated theoretical problem behind, because the issue is what sort of questions with clear answers could we have that define minimally rich enough space to distinguish between groups, very diverse groups, right? So things like what sort of document, with frequency, how many members. I know, that sort of question. Like, if you can imagine a finite and not inhumane number of questions that you can answer with some very basic set of options, and that by everyone answering those questions, you get on the other side the very distinct sorts of groups we want to accept, right? I mean, one of those questions can be, is this group part of another group, something like this. But I think if this is imaginable, even a play version of what we're talking about with, I don't know, Google Drive, with folders, with partial access, I mean, you can start playing with that, So I think that conceptually, the initial problem, and I think you worked a lot on it, Renzo, because you try to minimize drastically the sort of entity that this space allows for, and it already allows for a very rich sort of structure emerging, right? But I think for now, what looks like the basic step is imagining if this sort of description, self-description, right, of the norms of a group is possible with a certain limited amount of parameters that are reasonable for people to understand, that can then produce not only the access to the group, but also something and the standards to which a group is verified by others, right? For example, imagine here our own group. We made a commitment to make public all the meetings we have, right? So a third party could verify that. We say we are meeting weekly, therefore some sort of weekly register should be available, right? That's like the minimal normative thing that others can verify if it exists or not. So I think that coming up with a way to checking if this makes sense, you know, that's where I think the first step should be. Just a second. Pessoal, só pouquinho embaixo. I think somebody started a reform in my house without people. I don't know if I'm making sense, but
I think my impression so far is, I mean, this is wonderful. I'm really for this the structure here. I think just coming at it from the perspective of a potential like bad actor, someone who wants to disrupt or you know, kind of destabilize a group or set of groups. I imagine that since we're not tying your real identity to your representation in the system, I, as a bad actor, can generate many versions of members, right? If this is decentralized, no one is moderating membership, so I could generate a lot of fake people, right? Fake members, and you know, if it comes down to adjudicating or verifying a particular event happening, I can, you know, since I control the majority of these fake accounts, I can control the outcome of that vote, let's say. So I don't think this is an insolvable problem, but I think it's something to consider, because how do we avoid these kind of generated accounts, and like, we need some kind of model of trust, I think.
Yeah, the one Renzo proposed was that to be included, you need to be referred, right?
Yeah, but I mean, I could create a fake account and then have that account refer other accounts, right?
Yeah.
That I created.
Yeah, one thing that I think the circle did that is, I mean, I think it's an experience that has a part to play in this, is that, you know, we are a communist organization in Brazil that accepts any member that fills a form with absolutely no personal questions, right? And we had in about 10 years of history, 3 perhaps people who were bad actors. And I think that partially is because we're totally irrelevant, and that explains it. So that should be accounted for. But I think that there is something else that really shouldn't be dismissed, and I don't think it's hard to bring into play here, which is organizations that exist only if some activities are done. They have one thing in their benefit, which I would say is a sort of unconscious activism. Let's say you're a bad actor and you want to fuck everything up, but in order to fuck everything up, you need to have achieved you need to maintain some conditions within the group. So you need to, I don't know, do some activities together with some other people. You need to produce some documentation that others can verify. If you fake it for 6 months, you think you're faking, but you actually did it. So, you know, like, the faker is faking in the sense that if you can pretend for some time and actually do the work, you're actually doing the work. And that happens in the circle. Like, we don't ask people's ideological position. but the structure of the group is quite egalitarian. So you might think you're a fascist Nazi, but if you join this group and you follow these rules, you don't know what you are. You're not a fascist Nazi, I'm sorry to say. You see my point? Like, depending on the previous conditions, for example, for referral of new members, you need to be active for 6 months, have done some things or whatever. Well, if you actually did those things, you participated, you helped out or whatever, I mean, either you will give up before because it will be ridiculously tedious and too much effort, or you might not be as bad of an actor as you think.
Yeah, good point. So yeah, I think that's kind of like saying that membership in the group is already, it's not for free in a way, because you have to fulfill certain conditions. And if you pay the cost of being in the group, meaning not necessarily paying anything, but paying your work, your patience or your time, then you are automatically kind of a trusted, you're trusted within the system because
yeah, that's my point. Like, I think what we call trust should be very objectively defined. Of course, I totally agree with you that this is a serious, real problem. But I think that this initial idea that belonging is conditional and it's time sensitive, right? I mean, if you're not doing anything for long, you're already removed from the thing. There is a qualitative sense to what it means to do something with regards to the platform. So there are specific documents that measure up to specific standards that other parties will verify. If you try to fool people for some time, that will actually cost you some actual activist work, right? So I don't know. I mean, I think that you raise a good point that, for example, only participating in decisions and verifications of others shouldn't be enough for somebody to belong, because those are the things that are cost-free in a certain sense, right? I just verify randomly, yeah, it was done, and I decide in some troll-like manner if something should be approved or not. That's cost-free, right? But if you need to produce documents to be verified by third parties, it's content sensitive in a way, so it's actually it costs something to fool the platform, right?
Yeah. I think it would be very difficult to build up a large number of controlled accounts. I mean, because every account would have to be a fully active member of some group with conditions. Like, imagine having to, if you want to create 1,000 fake accounts, now you have to write 1,000 notes per week to keep membership. Yeah, it would be kind of
yeah, I don't think it's impossible, and I do think that if, let's say, something like this gets off the ground, it's a very, I imagine it would be a target for something. I mean, but yeah, I don't know. I just think that these are issues, these are, let's say, aspects of it that make it, that should be taken into consideration. You know, like it's another reason why I think conditional behavior, conditional belonging in the sense of, you know, again, goes back to that idea that these normative principles of what constitute a group and belonging to a group, that they are very central because they set the standard and they create the metric of what it means to exist as that group, right? We're a group doing this thing, so we need to post our balance sheet every bi-monthly and something else, right? We set that that's the criteria for evaluation, and other people then evaluate us by that criteria. So that's why I think that imagining the least amount of universal questions that can determine, you know, this basic normative structure for a group is a very nice bridge between the very general theoretical discussion and already some basic question of feasibility, you know, because it implies that we're really kind of bringing it down to some initial parameters for what it means to, I mean, I think also from what I understood, there's no possibility that there is a member that is not part of any group, right? Or is there? Is it meaningful to be in an organizational platform without being in any organization?
I mean, unless you just want to check from the outside whatever the organization is making it available.
Yeah. So we can have external observers, like.
Yeah. I mean, you could like.
UN observers.
Yeah, but yeah, I mean, I was thinking about like how it's becoming more and more frequent, this kind of like recurrent funding, in which depending on how much you pay recurrently, you get access to like inner and more like privileged information, right? So once you like finance like this, maybe like a agency for journalism, if you pay like X, you get to see like you receive a news feed, and then you pay more, and then you get to participate in some weekly meeting, like monthly meeting, and then so I think it's useful to think about like this implementing this
levels of access,
not just based on how much you pay, but also on what work you do. So you could have an organization that has like this outer zone in which once you're part of it, you get to see like weekly reports on what we've been up to. And I mean, you're interested in having access to that. And in order to have access to that, you just have to do something. And if you want to like have another level of clearance, then you have to like manifest some sort of intention and then fill in some more stuff. So already I think thinking in terms of like just implementing this, it's useful.
Mm-hmm.
One question I have is like how much we should focus on. Do we have to just like implement the logic of these workings, or we would have to minimally implement like a Google Drive or like a chat system? Like what's the minimal amount of implementation work in order for this to be like minimally useful?
I mean, I think that the big issue is security. I mean, if we keep that aside for a bit, right? And the question is, can there be a structure of nested groups that preserve those structures that you described, right? It seems to me that the fundamental question is there a way to both determine inwardly to a group its structure in a way that the platform can constrain you and you're not informing, you're actually going to be constrained by it, right? Something you will lose access if you don't keep up with what you yourself said you would do, right? And externally, can we regulate how those rules and that collective effort appears to others, right? And that's partially regulated by that rule itself, because you would have to enter the parameter of visibility, right? But the inside material, so chat, folders, the platform for documents to go, I think that can be all kept to the side because there are many tools for that, right? But that particular part of it, I mean, when the circle tried to develop some basic form of this, we looked into like managerial softwares and things like this. And they're all so they have so much building to what they call like a work group or something like this, you know? It's true that there already are tools that allow, for example, you create a work group, you define who is in, what they're gonna do, like it's a mixture of Trello and some workspace software, you know? But that level of freedom of defining what it means to be in that space, and that connection between doing and actually being in that space, I've never seen anything like that. So that's what I think is the really precious point, you know, of knowing if it is possible or not.
Yeah, I think the workflow of implementation changes drastically if encryption is like if you start from like this imperative of building everything in a way that you have like this encryption system, then you have to design from like this really basic building blocks of visibility. If you want to like just emphasize the logics, the formal logics of membership without really being super word, then I think there are many ways of, but I think it gets, yeah, it's two different like pathways to take.
Yeah, I don't know. I have the impression that, let's say, to bring this forward in a way that others might get interested in developing the stuff that we don't have the means to develop, we should have I mean, the thing I would think that would convince others is the thing that allows you to structure a group, set your own tasks, and then actually build upon this, right? I mean, the contents of a group and what are the, I think it's, everyone will understand that, okay, if you say this needs to be more encrypted and this is a big challenge, that this needs to be done from the ground up. But I think not, I mean, many times I tried to suggest, I remember I had a meeting with a friend of Caron's, Claudio, a long time ago. And Claudio is a programmer, and his point was like, he said it's undoable because of this sort of flexible normative aspect. You know, wanting groups who have different structures, and then these different structures to be part of a larger structure, and keeping track of this, for him was already, I mean, for him at least, it seemed like it was a task he wasn't interested in doing. So I think that giving any feel for this has a better chance of convincing people to get on board, you know, than anything else. But it's amazing also how much of the stuff we discussed actually is relevant for coming up with this. Like, it makes a lot of stuff, crazy stuff we talk about, seem less absurd. It's nice.
Yeah, it's really tektological, right? And it's the perspective.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I really like this perspective thing, you know. I mean, it's the sort of thing that I think is always hard to, it's nice to see a use for this sort of imagination of things are not totalizable, and it not being like a total, not meaning a lack of form, but a very strict form, you know, that because things have different levels of visibility, they will appear very different to each party. And I think that this really captures something that is absolutely missing from the regular way that the left maps its own terrain, because it's clear that different organizations don't see the same thing. But the problem is not that they don't see the same thing, it's that we usually don't know that we are not seeing the same thing. Like, it's not registered anywhere. It's not visible that you have a blind spot. Let's put it like this, right? So you're left to speculate on the things you're not seeing because you suppose you're seeing everything. So even having a platform that you are more aware that your view of a certain ecology of organizations is partial, because not everything is shared in the same way by everyone. I think it would really change how people discuss or how some things are thought through, you know?
Yeah, I think that's as you guys were saying earlier, the wealth, the form of wealth that this platform tries to play with is organizational activity, and the visibility of organizational activity, which is also why I think trying to build too much in the way of tooling is unnecessary, because like, for example, securing files, I think that would take a lifetime to properly get that working, because of just the nature of decentralization, making it's very hard to secure data in a decentralized way. But I think this thing about taking away visibility, I think, can be implemented more easily, because it's a matter of decision making. Like, you can decide to take away that visibility. But I'm not sure you can, and also like things like chat and stuff. There are other applications that could facilitate those things. But
I agree with you. I tend to agree. I think that if you define nicely I think that the document that needs to be the product that needs to be built into this is the document for verification that something was done. Like,
yes, yeah.
Because you need to guarantee very specific way of accessing it, right? But you can imagine a functioning version of this where very clandestine organizations, which are already invisible in a large extent to the rest, they adopt some, they don't even inform the way they don't share their material. So it might be even a further guarantee while the platform has no trust built, right? That you're not sharing too much, even though you want to share less. You're not using such an integrated space as that, right?
Yeah. I think I see what you mean. Like we should not build it assuming everything will be connected in the first place, or that a lot of other forms of wealth, like data wealth or whatever, secret documents and whatnot, they don't need to be on the platform. It's mainly just activities and verification of activities. That's the wealth. That's the form of data that should be the backbone of the app. And I mean, simply put, like an activity can link to some other platform. So you could say like, we wrote this document, but the document is hosted somewhere else. It doesn't matter where. Here's a link to it. And then that's what is verified. But then that link could disappear or go bad or change later on. I mean, there's ways to like verify that the link stays relevant, but it doesn't need to be built into the application. That way it reduces our amount of work we have to do at the beginning. Like mainly this is just a platform for verifying that activities have happened. And yeah, I think that's the main thing.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I think that I totally see why there is a very important class of organizations that without some very crucial kind of guarantee of secrecy wouldn't be interested in sharing some space. So I think that needs to be addressed in some way. But it's better to address it by first knowing what is, let's say, singular about the project, right? And then see how these things fit together and if they need to be totally built together or not, then think first. So yeah, from what Renzo presented today, I would say that that the structure of these rules and verification that they are implemented, right? And which is kind of the in platform, out of platform bridge. It ties it to actual stuff, but also the internal actions to the platform. So for example, creating a new group out of existing groups, creating an agreement, right? Creating something that has already a complicated structure or proposing a new plan. Like, I think those two parts of it, registering relevant data of organizations and allowing us to build on that existing set of data to create new structures that only exist inside that space, right? With their own rules and so on. I think that seems to be the core. And the twist to it is that if these parameters are well defined and they're plastic enough, you can see how from them you can build very, very complex structures, right? And then it seems like the user interface, since the visualization of this information is not a parallel or a secondary accidental aspect. It is pretty much half the point of it, right? Creating this sort of different way of accessing this data seems to be the other part of what's singular about it, right? Which implies different levels of what is visible, what is not, being able to get a feel for an ecology, right? Which might come up with a different idea, right? I mean, I think this is the sort of thing that I can see this really contributing to. Like, if you see a problem repeating very often, but in heterogeneous conditions and with different people, the chance that you will come up with a solution for it is larger. It's more likely, right? Whereas while we're atomized in different fields of struggle, sometimes we're going through the same problems and nobody develops an interesting solution because they don't even know the problem is repeating everywhere. So making sure that organizations and groups are aptly described by the platform, and the constraint that the platform makes on the groups is an actual constraint, and making sure that we can see, right, under some restriction, but we can kind of see that playing out. I think those are the two things that guarantee that new things will appear from inside of this.
Yeah, the constraining part is interesting because we're discussing what should the rule writing look like, right? And at first we were thinking something like an automatic thing, or like something that is machine readable, which I mean I still think is a good idea. It should be something that obeys certain, I don't know, like like a certain grammar that we would define.
Mm-hmm.
It's like exactly like this, like a functional notation for things. But I wonder if, I mean, there's limits to this, right? Because not everything can be automatically checked. There would be, well, I guess that which can be automatically checked can be in here, but then there should be kind of like escape hatches in the rules which require like some outside intervention. So
yeah, those are the proof of work things we were talking about. Like, for example,
yeah.
To be very basic about it, imagine that we agreed to do this meeting. It was set on the platform. The most stupid version of this is we all get an email after the meeting, automatic email. If you don't respond to that email, you fail to give proof or something, something like this.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
I mean, that's the most idiotic version. But then let's say that's the quantitative part of verification that can be perhaps automated. You said you would hand in something by this moment. We can see if it was handed in or not. But then comes that other idea that members they need to offer some verification work, right? Because then it is up to be verified by others, the content of some document, right? So if the document was handed in or not, it might be more automatically verifiable if you uploaded it somewhere under a certain deadline. But the content of that document remains to be evaluated depending on the task. It might require that added, right? I mean, for example, in the circle, we don't evaluate content. So we automated this. Today, people send notes, and if they send it, whatever is inside that document, it's marked as handed in. If they don't send it, it's marked as they're in debt. But the content of the work notes is not being evaluated. It's not part of our metric, right? But we could just add that verification for these particular cases where then the content of some document is relevant.
Yeah, I like this. So actually, the language can be part machine, part human verifying, because you could say like if these conditions meet, and then one of those conditions requires a vote to be called, or requires, like you said, email to be sent out to everyone, and some action must be taken, then the procedure would pause until all the human inputs would come back, right? And then
and I think that this sort of idea makes very intelligible why a group needs to create its own rules. Because if in one hand those rules are meant to constrain the action, give some resistance against which you prove you exist, let's say, on the other hand, the same rules teach others how to evaluate what you're doing, right? So for for example, some crazy philosopher suggested that foreigners should vote on other countries' elections. And the idea was, if I want to vote in America's election, I should know what's at stake, and then I can evaluate. Like, if I have the knowledge, I can evaluate rationally if it's good or not, right? So that basic idea, I think, gives a very important role to this sort of proper structuring of the group, because when you set out the rules you want to follow, you're also teaching others how to evaluate if you're following them, right? So let's say I'm part of the platform, I'm automatically, let's say, in debt of 10 verifications. So they will start popping up, like, these people did this, it's time for evaluating of this group, something like that. I need to evaluate 10 of these. So I'll click on them, but since they already wrote down their rules of functioning, I know what is expected of them. And when the document comes in, I can assess the document with regards to the rules that they said they would do, right? So I have the information I need to evaluate if something happened or not. For more simple cases, of course, John mentioned more complicated ones, but it would build into the project the problem of, the reason why the information is there actually plays multiple functions, right? You're kind of obliged to engage with things. It's a very reason to be there. It's building to the structure that you should be learning about things and evaluating if they happen, right? Something like that.
Yeah. And there's kind of a back and forth there, because writing good conditions of satisfaction for whether something is true or not is part of the, not just writing, but like teaching what does it mean to validate a certain set of constraints. That's something that every member has to learn.
Yeah, I wonder I think, imagine this whole thing was done, okay, it's ready, we solved it, and the platform is online. I think that many organizations would not manage to register, not because they're not allowed to, but because they don't know how to answer some basic questions. Like, nobody's telling you to have a specific frequency or to work in this way, but just make explicit how we want to be seen or how we want to be judged. Or I think that already would be a filtering, of stuff that actually gets implemented and participates in things that wouldn't. Because there's a lot of, that's the sort of thing that is a bit of a political decision, right? That should be, I think, also very carefully planned, because if you cannot ask too much of groups to make them exist in the platform, because many groups only find out what they are about in time, right? So otherwise you put the sort of threshold of a cutoff at a too sophisticated level, like only people who already have a very clear sense of what they're doing when they're doing or whatever can join. I think that's at least one issue to consider. Another thing I was thinking is that there is an economy of, if this holds, right, this idea of votes and verifications and propositions of, there is an issue to consider, which is the economy of how quickly would the amount of necessary verifications kind of expand, because for every group, there would be everything that every group creates a certain track of things to be verified in the future, right? And if a group conjoins with another, creates a new track. So you can have a very, very small number of members, but a large number of groups. And even though there are few people, a lot of stuff needs to be verified,
Yeah, we could actually quantify it with a metric of number, like before you join this group, the average number of verifications that each member has to do in that group. is this amount. And that actually quantifies a certain type of work that you would be committed to if you joined, right? So like this group adds like, I don't know, on average 3 verifications a day or something, 3 verifications a week. Then you could evaluate if you're willing to take that on, but something like that.
Yeah, I wonder if we should also like focus like because I think all this validation systems and rule following is would be nice to implement in a way that in a minimal version, like the way that say like for example ongoing study groups in general function could already like work using this platform. So
I see.
it would be like a big cell, like, so in practice, people, for the thing to get out of the ground, like it would be actually useful for study groups functioning the way they already do, which gives us leverage to actually like involve people and convince people it's useful, while on the more like experimental speculative part, we're actually testing this level of validation. And so I wonder if we can create these two things so that we can think of a certain like group that would already use it and not change anything in the way they already function.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that is good as a testing ground is that we just had a meeting in the circle last week where that proposal, I think I mentioned here, of changing the structure to a more simplified structure where we have one general meeting for everyone in the circle, and we have organizations that are only partially involved, right? So rather than having subsets that are made of members, the idea we're studying is not implemented yet, but the idea is to give more autonomy to these organizations so that they're internally structured anyway, but they are part of that general meeting if they produce one document that attests to what they're doing, like a report, and they send one delegate at least to the general meeting. Mm-hmm. So that kind of starts, rather than the subgroup group structure that we have today, that goes complex very quickly and has no common forum, right? We have cells and they create subgroups, but cells were already partial groups, and subgroups are even smaller parts, even if they mix the groups together. And we had a problem of creating this larger common forum. We're trying to do the inverse now, have a common forum, and then other things partially participate in the common forum. So they can be organs in the circle if they fulfill some minimal conditions. Like send somebody to participate, but the rest might be totally kind of foreign to the circle. We don't need to be engaged, but at least one comes and one document reporting on what you're doing is produced. And that document goes on our website, and the map of these organizations go as well. So we keep a basic track of organizations that are reporting on what they're doing and meeting with a regular frequency to discuss different organizational challenges, right? And we're gonna have to redo everything that we had in terms of websites and platforms and so on. So it could be a testing ground in that sense, because it will involve very basic kind of visualization of different groups with different rules under the same heading. So the way that the circle exists now, it already requires us to, for example, have a place for our group, our current research group, other reading groups, groups that meet with trade unions, groups that are working together with more community aid projects. And so it might be a concrete challenge, you know, like to list a couple of groups, describe how they work a bit, and see, you know, what would have to exist for this specific groups to be implemented somewhere, you know. So we might have raw material if you guys think that it's helpful.
Yeah, I agree that the circle is a good place to start as a testing ground of this platform if it comes together.
But yeah, I don't know, man. I was really impressed the way you described it. Especially, I think the beginning, it made very clear how this diverges from, what's available. I always liked the idea, but I'm much more convinced now by your presentation.
Yeah, this was amazing. I really like the slides.
Yeah,
And
it made
then-
a lot of things more clear.
Yeah, and we just need to integrate it with TikTok at the end to ensure world
Yeah.
domination. If every document needs to be done in a TikTok with a dance.
Yeah, I'm excited to work on it.
Another thing
Yeah.
that I think, just to mention, it's more conceptual, but I think it was pretty relevant, is that you managed to make a distinction between what you call like association and power. And I mean, we didn't get to discuss economy, but it just seems like you add one operation of a type of exchange that changes, right? So if you exchange members, you get associations ultimately. Like members are only here, they're in both, right? That kind of gives the basic structure. So for example, if you had a protocol where you're defining the members that are in something, right? And you then update that set of rules as you go. What you will be seeing when you look at the platform is actually a certain history of association. If you just add the possibility that already constructed groups can associate by contracts and not by exchanging members, right? You're already getting into that other level. I think it's so if there's a way once a group is created to access some sort of additional rule which says for these two groups some rules follow, if they don't follow something happens, right? That's kind of already a structure of decision. That's how you delegate things. So you already entered this different realm, I think. Because it also allows for clandestine organizations to be, because they're not exchanging members. If they're not exchanging members in any way, the only way they can be interacting is if you create an external protocol that doesn't really include the inside of an organization, right? And I wonder what we would have to make a more kind of productive kind of economic space there as well, you know, if it would be a matter of currency being exchanged or something like that. But it's amazing. Should we end it here then?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Well, do we discuss like next steps or?
Yeah, it's a good question. How would you begin to like? Where would you move from here? Like, I can see some stuff. Like, for example, I can gather information about a couple of groups, organizations, and things that we could know with some quantitative data, like as a sort of model for us to start toying with, you know. We could do some like just gather some stuff so we can say how would this look for this group? Like go there. We could see if we can come up with just have a discussion focused on, you know, relevant rules for group structure. Like what could be these basic criteria, right? And already thinking in terms that is not like totally far-fetched criteria, but actually most of them could be automated, you know. So criteria connecting to time, sort of document, or things like this. I'm not sure what you guys think.
Yeah, we could probably start with rules for like our group,
Mhm.
and then
Yeah, I
see where it goes from there. Yeah.
Yeah, I think we should, yeah, definitely start from our group, but I think we should think of what is the trivial group, right? What is the most, what is the smallest group that still satisfies like our vision for this? And then also what is like a trivial rule that, you know, like what is the simplest rule that we could implement? Something like that.
Yeah.
And then I think like creating groups, tasks, and events, those are, I don't know, wouldn't say they're easy exactly, but they're not nearly as difficult as the custom rules engine thing.
Yeah.
But you know, like creating a group, it's just like a piece of data. But then once we have the trivial versions of each of these, like the simplest group, task, and event, we can use them as inputs into the rules, right?
Yeah, Dennis, what do you think would practically be the best way to like develop and deploy this? I guess you're the web developer guy.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't thought about it that much, but I think maybe just set up a simple database. Like the architecture I'm thinking about is an event-based one, because something you mentioned, Renzo, earlier about being able to see the evolution of a group or set of groups. That means that we have to track everything that has happened on the platform, right? And in that sense, that is the thing, that is the concrete thing that is owned by everyone in the group, is the record. So a record would be a list of events that's immutable. You can't edit anything that has already happened, but you can only add a new event onto the log, right? And then everything is built on top of that record. So, I mean, a simple example of, you know, banks use this, right? When you have like a bank account and you have like your balance, it's actually not a number stored somewhere in some database, because then someone could just edit that number and you would change the amount of money you have. But that number is actually built up from a list of events that have happened. So like deposit 100, withdraw 50, deposit 200, you know, and then by playing those events forward, you construct the your bank account. So similarly, I think the view of the group should be constructed from events. So like event number 1 would be like the group was created. Event number 2 would be like, you know, Dennis joins the group. And then event number 2 might be Dennis leaves the group. Then you can actually play this event. You can jump back in time and see what happened at any point, because the events are immutable. I think, yeah, I mean, that's the basic idea of, I think, how you would implement.
I see.
Yeah.
Yeah, similar to a version control a little bit, right?
Exactly. Yeah, like very much like version control, but no rewriting. I mean, some version control systems allow you to rewrite the history, but I think it's valuable to say that you can never rewrite it, because that helps with having multiple viewers trust this same record.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think it would.
Sorry, man.
It would be both useful to get a little bit more concrete in the implementation side, like how to represent all the structure a group contains, like it has to like record number of members, the tests, and how to like track that in time. This Dennis was saying, but also coming up with kind of like I think coming up with a nice presentation with the interface, like how that would look like from the user point of view would also be really useful to get like an intuition of how using the app would look like, and also like showing to other people. So I think this two.
Yeah, I think
mean,
that one thing that really helps deciding what to do next is also deciding where we think we as a group should arrive at. Like, I don't think we're, I mean, considering that we were going to implement this ourselves. So what should we have that is convincing to others to get them on board to implement, right? So that's why I think the idea of like getting a feel for the interface, things like this are relevant, because we need to, I think we need to show like why this idea makes sense, to show that it's done in the minimal, like there is a minimal form for it that is already usable, right? And a sort of feel for what it would be like if it's done, so people can kind of get enthused by it, right? I mean,
that's true. Yeah, yeah.
Right.
No one's going to be excited if we describe it to them like this. It has to be, yeah, it has to be something they could use or click around in, basically.
Yeah, I think, I mean, I don't think we need to get at that point now, perhaps, but just having the idea that, okay, the output of this project as part of this research group is to, let's say, have a good description of why this is relevant, you know, in a way that convinces others and describes what it is. Already some development of, you know, the direction that this minimally needs to go to be implemented, and to show that there is work done in the direction of making this something feasible, and then some sort of fake model of it working that can be just animated or whatever, just so people get a good idea of what it is. Because with that sort of idea and perhaps some estimate of, you know, this is a task of this magnitude or that magnitude, then we can set up something to bring people in, create a separate group that can just manage, you know, taking it forward. And, you know, I think answering a lot of questions about possible problems, managing to empty out false, you know, situations of reinventing the wheel as well. So making sure we have a good awareness of what already exists, what we don't need, what tasks we don't need to put in the basket because they're already solvable some other way. I think all that pre-work, you know, will make us be in a position to actually get other people excited to take this forward. Because I think that ultimately what makes, the reason why this is not being done by anyone already is not technical difficulty, is it's not common to approach organization from this perspective and to consider that there is, as we were calling, like something like a wealth of data that is relevant from that perspective, right? So I think ultimately, the more we go in that direction, we'll be doing the contribution that we alone can do, and making it easier for others to bring their expertise, which we wouldn't be able to do on our own. So perhaps kind of defining, you know, like a basic strategy for that sort of, I don't know what's the word in English, like maquette, like a toy model of it, right? Or just a mannequin for show, defining the steps to arrive there with something that is rational and that is intelligible for people who can actually, you know, put their hands on it, and also perhaps having a strategy for, you know, not counting with pure voluntary work. So what sort of structure could we imagine to make this a work for others, an actual remunerated task? You know, I think those are the sort of things we can really get our hands on. And of course, it entails anticipating possible programming problems and strategies and so on. But I think it contextualizes it in something that we can actually deliver.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know, I think that with not that much work on this direction, like starting to think how we would look, giving a good description of the purpose and how it can change something and help, and also anticipating the sort of technical issues and already preparing that conversation, the ground for that. I don't think we'll have that much difficulty finding people who might be interested in taking this up, you know?
Yeah, are we in agreement that this should be an open source? Like any code we write or whatever should be public?
Yeah, I think so.
Right? Yeah, so then it's really, I mean, it's simpler to get other people involved if they want to. It's like just send them a link to GitHub or whatever.
Yeah.
And then.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's something to discuss. So I'm not really, I have absolutely no experience with this sort of collective code writing and things like this. I'm not sure what works best, you know, because if this wasn't that sort of project, it was a different sort of project, the thing that I would be imagining is that we could, for example, create a sort of crowdsourced project where all organizations that, you know, give some, they get a saying or they get a chance to kind of inform the project a bit. So it will be more, it's much more likely that it will fit their organization afterwards. You know, it's open source afterwards, but if they invested in it and they help to pay for the programmers and so on, then the likelihood or the input that they will be allowed to give makes it so that we already contemplate some of their issues as we go. It's good for the project because it tests our ideas as we go along, but it also makes it, you know, something that some money goes into it, because otherwise it's just kind of free floating. I'm not sure.
Yeah, no, I really like that idea too. So we would still create the mannequin.
Yeah, I think all of this would come later, right? We present, like we create a page with, you know, you can fund it here, and the thing you're funding is this, and then there is a text, video, we have some discussions with people, they can see that we thought this through, is not like out of this world, so we already had conversations with programmers, we know the sort of thing that this entails, how much money and time it would take, and they have some animation or something they can interact with that gives them a feel for what it would be, you know? Then I think that could be enticing for people to invest, be part of the discussion to produce, you know, they pay the production, and of course it's open source afterwards anyway, but it's different, right? To have to receive this thing, to have access to a code that is just what it is, and to actually have informed how it played along, right?
Yeah.
And the nice end product is having like a really sellable like crowdfunding page with like a text that motivates like a working thing of video, and
yeah, I think that it makes an objective more clearer for us, at least, right? Even if we change our mind in the process, I'm not sure. I'm always a bit distrustful of this crowdfunding thing, but at least it would give some bearing, you know, like let's go in this direction, create this material. It should convince. We have an idea of the address of the material, you know, and we can change as we go, of course. But I think it could work. I don't know.
Also, so should we make a separate WhatsApp for this, like a channel?
Yeah, I think it might be a good idea. I mean, we can perhaps use the one we created for the
site.
For the site, but yeah, because probably would be good not to flood the research one, and then we can discuss there when we want to present again and what we want to present. And I think that, for example, we can bring some experiences we have with problems and stuff that worked in the circle in a more detailed way, you know. I've never tried to actually describe the architecture, but today we have, I don't know, we use like 10 different softwares mixed together in a weird bundle. Like seeing a failed case might be useful to see what could be a better solution. I don't know. So I don't know, we can discuss possible next meetings and in more detail. But for me, people who watch this video, they should be convinced already. I mean, Renzo, I thought it was so amazing, man. I'm not sure if it's because I was already sold on it, but you had me at Tech Talk. You're right, already.
Yeah, I really like this idea. I'll learn web development just to work on this, honestly.
Amazing.
So.
Okay, guys. So.
Okay.
See you guys later then.
Yep.
Okay,
Bye.
great meeting. See you guys. Thanks, Renzo.
Thanks.